everyone, family. Welcome to Blacklogic. Texas lawmakers are trying to block federal funding for states that create laws to pay reparations for slavery. Fifth-term U.S. Republican Brian Babin introduced H.R. 4321 on June 23rd with 13 co-sponsors. Babin told Fox News that American taxpayers shouldn't be forced to pay radical race-based reparation payments to please the woke left. There has been a slew of legislation proposed by majority of the Democratic Party for references for reparations, but they are all do-nothing legislation that's been proposed by the Democratic Party to appease black people to once again vote democratically that holds no tangible and no direct payments of reparations, no land grants, no forbid tax laws or any of the sort. Referencing H.R. 40 that was proposed by Sheila Jackson Lee, who is a Democrat, commissioned to study and develop reparation proposals for Black American Act, more so African American Act. But as we know, this is a lineage-based reparations, so we can't get inside of the whole African American. If you're not familiar with H.R. 40, here's a synopsis of what the bill entails. It states, this bill established a commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. The commission shall examine slavery and discrimination in the colonies in the United States from 1619 to the present and recommended appropriate remedies. The commission shall identify 1, the role of the federal and state governments in supporting the institution of slavery, 2, forms of discrimination in the public and private sectors against freed slaves and their descendants, and 3, lingering negative effects of slavery on living African Americans in society. We need to understand that these are do-nothing legislations that simply by having a study or proposal of the tragedies and horrors that our forefathers and ancestors went through are do-nothing legislation that buys the Democrats time once again in order to motivate and galvanize the black vote just as well as they did for Joe Biden. That 87% is the amount that put Joe Biden over the top to win the term for his current presidency. Since H.R. 40, there have been other do-nothing legislation to once again to trick and fool black people into constantly and consistently voting Democrat. Are you guys familiar with Con 44? Yes, I said Con because that's exactly what it is. It states here, urging the establishment of the United States Commission on Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. This was introduced by Barbara Lee, Democrat. The summary states, this current resolution affirms more than 400 years after the arrival of the first slave ship that the United States owes a debt of remembrance to those who lived through slavery or other historical injustice against people of color. So this is not essentially for Black Americans, African Americans. This is for everyone who's considered themselves non-white. Also, it says, as well as to their descendants. It also urges the establishment of a U.S. Commission on Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. So this is, again, a do-nothing policy that is asking the American government to acknowledge and to apologize to aggrieved groups that are non-white in America. So if you believe that this is for reparations, or this is a piece of legislation that's going to turn the tide and cripple and disable the system of white supremacy in America, then you will once again fall for the trick bag of how they introduce do-nothing policies and legislations to show and propose to black folk as a token and trophy to motivate you to vote once again Democrat. Once again, here is another do-nothing legislation that was proposed, Res 414 by Cori Bush. Now, this so-called resolution is not a resolution, but this is a historical slavery timeline that points out major historical slave transactions, slavery incidents, massacres, rape, theft, hangings, murders, and a slew of other tragedies that our ancestors have been through in this country. But once again, this information is publicly known, and putting this into legislation does nothing for foundational Black Americans in the form of reparations. And form of reparations are direct cash payments that are to be paid out with the initial large payment and then monthly payments after that, as well as land grants and the forbiddance of paying taxes in this country just as well as the Native Americans. This red states, recognizing that the United States has a moral and legal obligation to provide reparations for the enslavement of Africans and its lasting harm of the lives of millions of black people in the United States. And as you can tell, this is a trick bag because it not only states black people, but it also states Africans as well. So we need to understand one thing when it comes to African Americans and black Americans. There is a large difference here. African Americans are Africans that migrated to America and gained their citizenship through legal avenues. Whereas though black Americans, foundational black Americans, U.S. freedmen, are descendants of enslaved people that came to this country back in the mid-1500s. So again, this is another piece of legislation that a Democrat is proposing that not only uses trick language, but also may provide an argument for African Americans to receive reparations as well. This may be confusing, but understand this. You are a foundational black American, you are a U.S. freeman if you descended from slaves in this country, meaning that your people have been here at least from the mid-1700s, where slavery was still the thriving business in America that did over 90% of the labor in America, especially in the southern states, as well as northern and western states. We understand that during these times, there has been a great push on reparation from grassroots entities from around the country and essentially all the major cities. Last month, Texas lawmakers, by the way of Brian Babin, proposed H.R. 4321, which states to prohibit the United States government from providing bailouts or other financial assistance to any state or local government that enacts any law providing reparation for slavery and from other purposes. This proposed block on reparation is coming from a very white supremacist and racist narrative that black people don't deserve reparation. Reparation has nothing to do about what is deserved to a particular people. It has everything to do about what is owed to a particular people of our ancestors that did the work, who was killed, raped, murdered, dismembered, burned alive, and hung, that built the foundation of America and all the trillions of dollars that this government and this country has entailed. That's why we see immigrants and migrants from all other countries come to America more so than any other Western world, more so than any other white majority country in the world, more so than in the UK, more so than Europe, more so than South America, more so than Asia. Everyone comes to America for two reasons: opportunities and to become rich. And that is based upon the blood, sweat, tears, and cries of our ancestors putting in the work that built the very foundations of this country and trillions of dollars of mass and wealth that has been accumulated in interest over the course of time. If you guys are not familiar with some of the groups that have not received reparations in America, let me take a really small trip down memory lane in order for you guys to get the information here. So first and foremost, there's over 500 federally recognized tribes of the Native American people that the American government have stole their land and essentially almost extinct majority of their people. And to this day, the U.S. government is still paying reparations to Native Americans through many different funds and providing a numerous amount of resources in order to sustain them, where majority of Native Americans do not work. As we're looking at this, you can tell federal recognized Indian tribes and resource for Native Americans. It states here that they receive food assistance for Native Americans. The food distribution program on Indian reservations provide monthly packages of healthy food. You may be eligible based on income, tribal membership, and where you live. It also states financial assistance and service for Native Americans. Federally recognized tribes can apply for government funding for services and programs. Some programs provide funds directly to tribal members on living or near reservations. Housing assistance for Native Americans. The government offers funding to tribes and Native American individuals and families to buy and renovate housing. So let's take a quick look at how some of this funding and resources would be given to the Native American tribes. It states here, building on feedback from extensive tribal constellations, the budget provides $4.7 billion for the Department of Interior's tribal programs, more than $690 million above the 2023 enacted level, including investments that will support public safety and justice, social services, and educational needs to uphold federal trust responsibilities. Also, the Biden-Harris administration makes $135 million commitment to support relocation of tribal communities affected by climate change. Where's the money for those Katrina survivors? You don't see any support from this government during those Katrina survivors or any other tragedies that occur in majority Black cities or majority Black areas. Where's the support for the Chicago residents that are now having influx of illegal immigrants that have been based in their communities and now drying up the resources in their area? Also, inside of the American Rescue Plan that a lot of Democrats voted for, if you're one of them, then raise your hand. Signed into law by President Biden on March 11, 2021, invest $1.75 billion in American Indian and Alaska Native government programs. When we look at this money, we're not correlating and connecting it to foundational Black Americans of the reparations that we are owed and not deserve. We don't deserve anything. We are owed by the blood, sweat, tears, and cries of our ancestors, while all these other groups that have been agreed by the American government are getting paid reparations in perpetuity. And just for a disclaimer, I'm not hating on the Native Americans or any other group that I'll be mentioning. They are owed what they're receiving. And when people ask me, what do reparations look like for foundational Black Americans, I tell them something similar to what the Native Americans are receiving. And lastly, they helped pass an investment in Native American programs that gave the Native American community another $31 billion roughly 2 years ago. If some of you was curious about some of the financial assistance that the U.S. government gives to Native Americans, here's a small synopsis of what that entails. It states that general needs such as food, clothing, shelter, and utilities, child care, emergency including home destroyed by fire, flood, or other disasters, adult care for in-home or residential care of Native Americans who are older or have a disability, burial costs of tribal members with a low income. Basically, more so than not, these are large grants amount that the Native American community receive each and every year. That's why a vast majority of Americans never really see true Native Americans, because Native Americans, for the most part, stay on their reservations because reservations are sovereignty land that they don't pay taxes, that they get land grants, housing grants, monthly assistance. As it states here, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is kind of their management company, manages the Financial Assistance and Social Services Program. It gives financial aid to tribal members who cannot get temporary assistance for needy families. So if you don't qualify for the federal government program that is offered to all Americans, don't worry about that. We have our own welfare programs because we also get federally funded from the U.S. government as well. So we understand that TAF is known as welfare, but you also have FAST, Financial Assistance and Social Services. It can be utilized for all the basic needs of life and even burial costs. Now, when we talk about aggrieved groups that are owed reparations in America, I understand that the Holocaust does not come to mind, but that didn't stop the American government from giving Holocaust survivors and their descendants millions and billions of dollars. It states here, when Obama was in office, it says combined with matching private funds, the approximate $2.5 million per year over the 5 years will support $4.1 million in programming annual for organizations to help Jewish survivors. This is essentially $12 million in earmark money that went to the Jewish community to assist, support, and reparations for Holocaust survivors. Also, Germany to give $1.4 billion to Holocaust survivors globally in 2024. And some of you may be stating that's not a lot of money, depending on how many survivors there are and given the amount of money that they need, as they would tell you, to live their lives in dignity. But there's one piece of information that you may not be familiar with. This assistance and forms of reparation has been given to the Jewish Holocaust survivors for a very long time. It states here that Germany agreed to pay approximately 1.2 billion euros to Holocaust survivors living around the world in 2023, bringing its total compensation to more than 80 billion euros. And for the time being, this reparations has been going on for over 70 years. But when it comes to Foundation Black Americans and their survivors of massacres and tragedies that decimated their cities and bankrupt their wealth because of bigotry, racism, discrimination in the system of white supremacy, Oklahoma judge throws out a suit seeking reparation for the Tulsa race massacre, even though the Tulsa survivors have historical evidence and proof, as well as pictures and personal testimonies of people who were there during that time. It states that Judge Caroline Wall on Friday dismissed with prejudice the lawsuit trying to force the city and others to make recompense for the destruction of the once thriving Black district known as Greenwood. And this is for those tethers. This is for those who are not aware of Black American history, that yes, at a point in time, we had numerous amounts of Black Wall Street that were thriving and they were doing very, very well. But every time we so-called pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, the system of white supremacy intends to destroy and knock us down because they never want to see Black people do well in this country. And Republican Brian Babin and some of his lawmakers may believe that the United States has already made amends for slavery through policies such as the Civil War Amendments, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. They may even argue that reparations would be unfair to those who are not descendants of slaves and that would be too expensive. Now, to counter those things very easily, these so-called Civil War Amendments, as well as civil rights and voting rights, those are according to the constitutions, and we are U.S. citizens. Those are given to us by rights by the forefathers of this so-called country that was stolen and built upon the backs of slaves in this country. Some lawmakers worried that reparations would reopen old wounds and further divide the country along racial lines. Let me tell you right now, we don't care. We're already divided. There's already racial lines, and things in America and the tensions of America and race relations in America hasn't got any better. And in some cases, it has gotten a lot worse. They may also argue that it's better to focus on policies that will help all Americans, regardless of their race. But when it comes to legislation that is for a particular people, like the anti-Asian hate crime bill that protects Asian Americans, also the anti-xenophobic, anti-discrimination law for LGBT community, you don't see them having the same smoke. And I guess other lawmakers may believe that it would be impossible to determine who is entitled to reparations and how much they should receive. They also argue that the government does not have the resources to pay reparations to all descendants of slaves. I have to call bullshit on that because they do have the money. You see the millions and billions of dollars given to Ukraine to support them against the war of Russia. You see the federal foreign budget. Have you seen the Bureau of Indian Affairs budget? Have you seen the amount of money going to the Jewish Americans and the Holocaust survivors? We need to look at these laws and comb through legislation of where all the money is going, because it's not going to Black communities. It's not going to foundational Black Americans. It's not going to our neighborhoods and our communities to rebuild and build and renovate infrastructure. If anything, it's going to the system of white supremacy in the form of redlining and gentrification. It's important to note that not all Texas lawmakers oppose reparation. Now, some have expressed support for the idea, arguing that it is a necessary step to address the legacy of slavery and racial injustice in the United States. However, the opposition to reparation is very, very strong in Texas, let me tell you, and it's unlikely that any legislation on this issue will be passed anytime soon, as well as the legislation that you have right here in front of you. And we also understand there are some specific historical and political factors that have contributed to the opposition to reparations in Texas. Now, for example, Texas was a slave state during the Civil War, and it has a long history of racial segregation and discrimination. As a result, there is a deep-seated belief among many white Texans that reparations would be unfair to them. That's because essentially Black people would be doing better than them. So when I see things like cities may be debating reparations, but here's why most Americans oppose the idea, whereas though a plurality of Americans don't believe that the descendants of slaves deserve reparation, let me tell you right here, we don't care. It's not about deserving something, it's about being owed something that the American government will pay. We will continue to beat the drum, beat the streets, and beat in front of your face and in your ears until you give us what you owe. You need to cut the check and stop the damn small talk. And lastly, I see here that slavery reparations cost U.S. government $10 to $12 trillion. Well, let me first tell you that number is very inaccurate. We must start off at $16 trillion and work our way up from there.